My mother's brother, my Uncle Rob, was a history teacher and a World War II buff. He was really into learning about the politics and events in Europe at that time, and he collected artifacts from all over the world that were related to that time in history. He had a knife used by British troops, some Japanese newspaper articles, and some American uniform pieces. He also had an old grenade that was supposedly found in France, but he used to joke that if I got out of line, he would pull the pin. But I don't think that thing ever worked. It was probably just a prop. His collection was in his office, and I mostly ignored it until I was in the 10th grade, and we learned about World War II. I wanted to know more, so I asked him more about his collection, and he explained each item he had in more depth. When he was done telling me, I remember asking him why he didn't have any Nazi artifacts. At this, his face dropped, and he put everything back on the shelves. "I don't want any of that stuff in my house," was all he said, and in a way that meant we were done talking about it. I took the hint and dropped it, but later that night, I asked my mom. She looked at me seriously, and I had no idea what she was about to say. Being a dumb kid, I thought maybe he wasn't able to find anything German from that time period. To me, it seemed like a million years ago. But that wasn't it at all. My mother got comfortable in her chair and looked at me carefully. "When you were little, probably 3 or 4, Uncle Rob went through a hard time. He's always been into war history, especially World War II history. He and I and your Aunt Melody went to some antique store in Charleston just after they had gotten married. Of course, he wanted to see what kind of war stuff he could find in there. But he found something he should never have bought. Behind the counter, in a black wooden box, the store owner had a journal that had supposedly been owned by a Nazi general. I didn't want to be anywhere near that thing, and Melody told him not to buy it. The store owner pushed hard for Rob to look at it, though, but oddly wouldn't touch the thing himself. He said he didn't want to damage it, but from the look on his face, I could tell he was afraid of it. We left that day without the journal, but Rob wouldn't stop talking about it. When he got home, he tried researching it to see if he could find if it was possibly authentic. I told him to drop it and asked him why he would want such a hideous thing. He said it was an amazing piece of history and it would be cool to have it in his collection. I didn't see him for 2 weeks, which was strange. You know we always spend time with them. Melody called, asking if we could go to dinner. When I planned for 4, she said Rob wouldn't be coming. She looked nervous and tired at dinner, and when I asked her about it, she said she hadn't been sleeping well. Rob was getting up in the middle of the night to go and look at the journal. She said she woke up one night and found him in the dark with the journal in one hand, looking off into the darkness of his office like he was in some sort of trance. She said she called to him and he suddenly turned and spit at her to go to bed, slamming the office door in her face. But that was just the beginning. A few days later, she woke before the sun came up and found him crouched down on the ground, facing into a dark corner of his office. When she went to him, he was cold with sweat, trembling, and his pajamas were soaked with urine. She managed to clean him up and get him to bed and stayed home to watch him that day. She figured he had the flu from one of his students, but that night things got really out of hand. Rob slept for a little while, but it was fitful. He was mumbling in his sleep and even cried out. So she wouldn't get sick, Melody decided to sleep in the living room, but woke up when she heard Rob shuffle into the office to get the journal. She reached for him to help him get back into bed, and his skin was cold with sweat again. He turned and growled something at her. She said she couldn't understand him because it sounded like another language. And again, he slammed the door in her face. She called me that night. I remember it was almost 11 because I was still awake. I told her I'd be by in the morning and we'd take him to the doctor. I woke up the next morning to 4 missed calls from Melody. I listened to them as I got out of bed. 11:47 p.m. Hey, if you get this, call me. She sounded worried. 1:18 a.m. Hey, I'm getting really freaked out about Rob. I just burned that damn journal. Call me. 1:35 and 2:25 a.m. Missed calls, but no message. I drove over there immediately and Melody answered the door. She looked exhausted and basically fell into me. She hugged me and said, We're okay. Apparently, while Melody was trying to get some sleep in the living room, she heard Uncle Rob arguing with someone in the bedroom. She knocked on the door and it suddenly got quiet. She opened the door and Rob was standing in the adjacent bathroom door in the dark. He was completely still, just watching her. And then she saw his eyes motion to the journal on the bed. He clutched the door frame like he was trying not to move. Burn it, he hissed at her. Melody grabbed it and ran to the fire pit outside. She said she doused it with lighter fluid and set it on fire. She watched it burn, the old paper embers floating into the night air. When Melody got back inside, Rob was curled up, panting on the bathroom floor. He told her the journal was evil. All he had felt while he possessed it was hatred and disgust. He had urges to kill Melody and the rest of us. He had vivid dreams of committing torture, while also feeling great pain and terror. He said he felt lost in time, trapped in his own body, but unable to escape the images in his mind and the pain he had been feeling. Through it all, the journal spoke to him with the voices of the dead, and all he wanted to do in the end was silence them. Since then, your uncle is really careful about bringing war memorabilia into his house, and he won't even look at Nazi memorabilia. He says there's no place for those things in our world. My parents bought an old house in North Carolina. It's a beautiful old building, but it needed renovation and repairs to be livable. We didn't have a ton of money, and my parents cleaned up the bottom floor so we could use it while they renovated the rest of the house. Their plan was to live on the bottom floor and rent out the rooms above as a bed and breakfast. I was a kid, so I thought the old house was awesome, partly because it was a huge mess upstairs with peeling paint and rotted floors. My parents warned me to stay downstairs. I thought it was a safety issue, but we found out the real reason when my older sister met some kids at her new school who said we had moved into the old haunted men's club. I learned that this was a place where men would go and pay for the company of women. This explained why the upstairs was divided into 8 bedrooms with a long hallway running down the middle. Soon after we moved in, my parents would leave my sister at home while we ran errands like we did at our old house. After a few times doing this, though, we came home to find my sister sitting down by the mailbox in the dark. My mom asked her why she was sitting there, and my sister said she had heard voices in the house. My mom checked the house and found nothing, but my sister insisted there was somebody upstairs. After that night, my sister refused to be home alone after dark. One afternoon, I was in the backyard that was overgrown and full of weeds. We would get to the yard last, it seemed. It was late May and very hot, with storm clouds threatening in the distance. I heard a woman laughing and realized it was coming from upstairs. I looked up and saw one of the windows was open. Well, this didn't make any sense. Not only was nobody supposed to be up there, but the rain would create more damage if it got in. I was about to yell up for my mom when I saw a hand reach for the window latch and slide it closed. For an instant, I saw a pale arm at the window. Then the shape of a woman appeared. She was tall and had big brown curls. Whoever that was, I was sure it wasn't my mother. My mom had straight blonde hair and was not very tall. I ran calling for my mom, who was outside bringing in the groceries. She went upstairs to check the rooms, but found nobody. My sister started calling the house haunted. My mom laughed and rolled her eyes. Well, maybe that's why it was so cheap. She laughed until she had her own encounter one morning. She was carrying her coffee out of the kitchen and looked up to see a ghostly man dressed in what looked to be a suit from the 1890s. The man looked right at her and tipped his hat. She said she almost dropped her coffee backing away and disappeared. There were many strange little encounters like this one, just glimpses or movement or voices. We'd smell cigars and hear footsteps, but sometimes we'd hear moans and giggles. My mom would turn up the TV or the music to avoid having to explain what was going on, but by then, we'd figured it out. Nothing changed after the renovations were finished, and we opened the bed and breakfast. We had guests that would report the same things we would see. We had one couple stay for only an hour once, after which they ran down the stairs to report they'd seen a woman in their bathtub who had just vanished when they'd spoken to her. After a year or so, the house was labeled as haunted, which brought paranormal investigators and all their equipment. We were even featured on the news once around Halloween. We rarely had any vacancies, even when there were no living guests. If you enjoyed that story, I'm glad you found me. I tell creepy stories about scary encounters and paranormal events. If this is your thing too, stay, listen, and subscribe to Lady Grimm for more stories. It's okay to keep the lights on. Let me tell you another story. There's a house in the neighborhood where I grew up that has an interesting story attached to it. As the years go by, the story keeps getting more and more elaborate, but this is how I heard it when I was a kid living near it. My family lived in an old part of St. Augustine, Florida. The town has quite a bit of pirate history, as it was a great location for raiders wanting to plunder Spanish ships heading back to Spain with their galleons of stolen treasures. The house in question has had many owners in its time, and it was actually rumored to be the home of the buccaneer Francis Jeffries, in actuality a successful pirate who amassed a great treasure for himself. But unlike most pirates, this one seems to be willing to share his loot. While I was growing up, this house had 2 different owners. The first we didn't know very much about. She was a woman in her 50s who had retired to Florida from New York. I remember she had a little dog that barked a lot, but we really only knew her in passing. The real story came from the second owner. The lady sold it to a man named Scott and his partner Mike, and they still live there to this day. When they moved into the house, they found a bottle of wine and a note that read, "Hope you have a piggy bank." They had no idea what that meant until a couple of weeks later. Once they were settled into the new house, they started comparing notes. Both of them had been finding quarters around the house. Scott found a small pile on the stairs one morning and didn't think anything of it, but when he found another small stack of quarters on the kitchen counter a week later, he finally asked Mike about it. Mike thought Scott had been leaving the quarters. They had no real explanation for finding coins around their new house, but it just kept happening. Always quarters, and at the most random times. There seemed to be no reason or predictability for finding the coins. They would just appear at random. One evening, a friend who didn't believe in the paranormal was visiting them at their house for dinner. After hearing about the coin-leaving ghost, she excused herself to go to the bathroom and laughed to herself about the ridiculousness of the story. As she was leaving the bathroom, a shampoo bottle flew off the shelf and hit her on the back of the head. She now refuses to come back into their house. I haven't seen Scott and Mike since I moved away, but my parents visit them for dinner on occasion. They still find the stacks of coins at random, and still have no idea where they come from. It's rumored that Francis Jeffries had a treasure stash somewhere near his house, but it's never been found. Outside of New Orleans, Louisiana, is Jackson Barracks, close to the Calumet battlefield where Andrew Jackson and his soldiers won the Battle of New Orleans. The entire area is haunted, and current National Guardsmen report hearing and seeing ghosts in the barracks, especially at night. They hear water running, toilets flushing, doors slamming, voices, and even footsteps. The sounds of troops marching can even be heard on the grounds. One of the most famous spirits is a man named Sergeant Henry Brunig. He was 38 years old when he died in the barracks in June of 1937. Henry was the caretaker and supply sergeant in the Washington Artillery, primarily responsible for the care of the horses that pulled the artillery carriages. At the time, horses were being phased out of use in favor of more efficient motorized vehicles. In June 1937, veterinarians examined the horses and declared that 21 of them were too weak and old for duty, and they were shot. The rest of the horses were moved away to other units. The following morning, they found Henry in the barracks. He had taken his own life. It's believed that he felt terrible sadness over the loss of the horses, and he's still seen, and his presence still felt, in the barracks to this day. Nearby, the final battle of the War of 1812 was fought. Although it would seem that the greatly outnumbered 3,000 American men would lose to the 6,000 professional British troops, that was not the outcome. The British loss was largely due to overwhelming American artillery power, with the battle lasting just over an hour. There were over 3,000 British casualties, but only 7 Americans were lost. The battlefield was covered in British dead. To this day, National Park Service volunteers report smelling gunpowder and hearing soldiers yelling and marching. And even more strange is that on that battlefield, where so many men fell, there is a large amount of thistle growing wild. Thistle is not a plant native to the U.S. and doesn't grow naturally in Louisiana. But it does grow wild in Scotland. The majority of those soldiers fighting for the crown on that fateful day were Scottish Highlanders. In Columbus, Mississippi, there is a grand plantation house that sits by a river, as many plantation houses do. The house was commissioned by George Hampton Young, a Georgia colonel, and completed in 1858. Although his wife died before the house was completed, Young became extremely wealthy. The plantation grew cotton and had over 1,000 enslaved people and other workers living on the property. To give you an idea of how large the plantation was, Young commissioned his own post office, a kiln, a cotton gin, an ice house, and a lumber mill and a leather tannery. The family home even had marble-lined swimming pools, a grand ballroom, and massive gardens. Waverly Mansion became the social center of Columbus until Young was forced to transition away from his slave labor force at the end of the Civil War, and his business declined significantly. George Hampton Young died in the house in 1888, and eventually the last Young family member died there in 1913. From that point, the house sat vacant and abandoned. It was almost completely ruined when Robert and Donna Snow, along with their children, bought it and restored it to its former glory. They report to have at least 3 ghosts on their property. The first is Major John, a man who died in 1835 after being orphaned and then lived under the care of the Choctaw Native Americans. He loved riding his horse near the river and would ride through the Young plantation to reach the water. To this day, you can hear the thundering hooves of a horse riding towards you on the grounds. You expect to be brushed past before the hoofbeats fade, but as he passes, there's no change in the wind, no movement as you'd expect, just the sounds of the horse rumbling by. The second ghost is that of George Hampton Young himself, who is seen in mirrors throughout the house. He is always clean-looking and well-dressed, still the Southern socialite, even in death. But the last ghost is a mystery. The Snow family began hearing her voice 2 years after they moved into Waverly Mansion. Donna heard the voice of a young girl calling, "Mama! Mama!" But when she went to her children, she found they hadn't called her. Over the next few years, she would hear the little girl often, always insistently calling for her mother. Donna would often see an indent on the bed of one of the guest rooms and believed it was the little girl who liked to sleep on that bed. Over time, the little girl became more aggressive, actively following Donna around the house. She reported hearing little feet on the marble floors following her as she moved from room to room. She wasn't really afraid of her anymore, but she was worried about her. One night, her own kids woke up to ask her about the little girl, as they had been woken up to the sound of her voice calling through the house. This went on for years, until one day when Donna was cooking and felt the little girl brush up against her calling, "Mama! "Mama," as she would do. When Donna turned and there was nobody there, she finally asked out loud, "What's wrong?" For the 10 years that followed, the family didn't hear the little girl. It was like she was gone. But then Mrs. Snow saw the familiar indentation on the little girl's favorite bed and knew she was back. To this day, the little girl has become more active in the house, often appearing as a full-body apparition or just peeking around the corners. She is often seen walking through the hallways in her nightgown, her little blonde ringlets cascading down her back, calling, "Mama, Mama."